interests are in the 18th and 19th century British poetry and prose, but she also works on contemporary literature. Her particular focus is identity constructions at the interface of gender and nation. She's also worked on crime fiction and on the spatial turn in literary and cultural studies. And if I have her book publications complete, she's published out about Autorinnen der viktorianischen Epoche, Victorian women authors, a fast-forward version of England Constructions of Englishness in Contemporary Fiction, Erziehung zur Tugend, Frauenrollen und der englische Roman um 1800, Women's Roles in the English Novel around 1800, and James Hogg, Selbstbild und Bild zur Rezeption des Ettrick Shepherd. Of her many essays, I've only selected a few recent ones with Scottish connections. There are plenty more. The Scottish Invention of Canadian Literature, John Buchan in Canada, Scots at War or Private Mucklewame's Lower Dorsal Curve, Ian Hayes, The First 100,000, James Robertson, The Fanatic, Edinburgh Monuments, Literary Canon and Cultural Nationalism, A Comparative Perspective, and very intriguingly, Walter Scott's Walking Stick. Also intriguing is the talk of that she is going to give us today. It is entitled very cheerfully, Prisons, Graveyards, Battlefields, Scottish Traumascapes. And with that, I'll hand over to Silvia.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to try and share my screen with you. Just a second.
Oh, that's it.
Okay, good.
Perfect.
I'm actually going to start by reading you a passage from Old Mortality. And it's a passage which has haunted me for years, and it's actually sort of the seed for this paper. It's a passage about what happens to the vanquished in any kind of conflict. The vanquished in this case are the Covenanters, and the victors are the Royalists, but to an extent this doesn't really matter. So here goes. And we see this from the perspective of the protagonist, who's called Morton, and more about him later. After about a quarter of an hour spent in solitary musing on the strange vicissitudes of his late life, the attention of Morton was summoned to the window by a great noise in the street beneath. Trumpets, drums, and kettle drums, contented in noise with the shouts of a numerous rabble, and apprised him that the royal cavalry were passing in the triumphal attitude which Claverhouse had mentioned. The magistrates of the city, attended by their guards with halberds, had met the victors with their welcome at the gate of the city, and now preceded them as a part of the procession. The next object was 2 heads borne upon pikes, and before each bloody head were carried the hands of the dismembered sufferers, which were, by the brutal mockery of those who bore them, often approached towards each other as if in the attitude of exhortation or prayer. These bloody trophies belonged to 2 preachers who had fallen at Bothwell Bridge. After them came a cart led by the executioner's assistant, in which were placed MacBriar and other 2 prisoners who seemed to be of the same profession. They were bareheaded and strongly bound, yet looked around them with an air rather of triumph than dismay, and appeared in no respect moved either by the fate of their companions, of which the bloody evidences were carried before them, or by dread of their own approaching execution, which these preliminaries so plainly indicated. Behind these prisoners, thus held up to public infamy and derision, came a body of horse, brandishing their broadswords, and filling the wide street with acclamations, which were answered by the tumultuous outcries and huzzas of the rabble. In the rear of these troopers came the main body of the prisoners, at the head of whom were some of their leaders, who were treated with every circumstance of inventive mockery and insult. Several were placed on a horseback with their faces to the animal's tail. Others were chained to long bars of iron, which they were obliged to support in their hands, like the galley slaves in Spain when travelling to the port where they are to be put on shipboard. The heads of others who had fallen were borne in triumph before the survivors, some on pikes and halberds, some in sacks, bearing the name of the slaughtered person labeled on the outside. Such were the objects which headed the ghastly procession, who seemed as effectually doomed to death as if they were the sanbenitos of the condemned heretics in an auto da fe. Behind them came on the nameless crowd to the number of several hundreds, some retaining under their misfortune a sense of confidence in the cause for which they suffered captivity and were about to give a still more bloody testimony. Others seemed pale, dispirited, dejected, questioning in their own minds their prudence in espousing a course which Providence seemed to have disowned, and looking about for some avenue through which they might escape from the consequences of their rashness. Others there were who seemed incapable of forming an opinion on the subject, or of entertaining either hope, confidence, or fear, but who, foaming with thirst and fatigue, stumbled along like overdriven oxen, lost to everything but their present sense of wretchedness, and without having any distinct idea whether they were driven to the shambles or to the pasture. This was my kind of starting point. And what I'm going to do now is I'll give a bit of background information for those of you who don't know the novel well enough, both on the novel itself and on the Covenanters. Then I'm going to talk about a country churchyard, and then I'm going to treat this country churchyard as a traumascape, and then I'll start thinking about other potential traumascapes. So, background. The Tale of Old Mortality and the Covenanters. Old Mortality was first published in 1816 as a part of a series called Tales of My Landlord, collected and arranged by Jedediah Cleist Botham, schoolmaster and parish clerk of Gandercleugh, in 4 volumes. It was initially conceived as a second volume of Tales of My Landlord, Tales of the West, the idea being that Scott was going to write 4 novels about the 4 corners of Scotland, as it were. But because it became so long in the process, it was eventually published together with the first of these tales, The Black Dwarf, in, as I said, 1816. The background is the very complicated history of Scotland in the 17th century. Just a very brief shortcut, if you like. When after the Civil War, the monarchy was restored in 1660 under Charles II, the Covenanter reforms of the 1630s were rescinded and bishops were reappointed. And those ministers of the church who refused to renounce these 1630s covenants, particularly the 1638 covenant, lost their position as a result, which led to various uprisings, particularly in the southwest of Scotland. And one of these uprisings, which is also going to be mentioned later, is a march on Edinburgh from Galloway in 1666. The novel itself is set in 1679, or the main part of it, rather. And in 1679, Archbishop Sharp of St. Andrews, who was hated by the Covenanters for deserting their course and aiding the restoration of Episcopalianism, was murdered. And this triggered yet another Covenanting uprising, which was initially quite successful in military terms, but was eventually put down by government forces led by John Graham of Claverhouse. And we've just seen the outcome of this. The plot of Old Mortality, Henry Morton, whom you've just met, is a moderate Presbyterian, and he's arrested by Claverhouse's troops for harboring John Balfour of Burley, one of the murderers of Archbishop Sharp of St. Andrews. I mean, he's not a historical figure, Burley, or Balfour rather. Morton is sentenced to death, but he's rescued by Lord Evandale, who is a friend of his and is also the rival for the hand of Edith Bellenden. And Morton, because of what happened to him, is so incensed that he actually joins the Covenanters and becomes one of their military leaders. When they are defeated at Bothwell Bridge, he is made to leave Scotland, and he enters the service of William of Orange and returns to Scotland after the Revolution of 1688. And he then learns that Edith is about to be married to Evandale because she thinks he's dead. But Evandale, handily enough, is killed in an ambush, and then they were wedded. In an essay on the text of the 1993 edition of Tale of Old Mortality, Douglas Mack quotes David Deiches. It was his Scots obsession. The word is hardly too strong, with Scottish history and Scottish landscape always for him most intimately connected, that led his imagination to dwell on problems of past and present, of continuity and change, of tradition and progress. There's surely no better example of this interconnectedness of time and place than the opening chapter of the second volume of Tales of My Landlord, Old Mortality, in which Peter Patterson describes his encounter with Old Mortality in the deserted burial ground outside the village of Gandercleugh. Patterson himself never learns the real name of Old Mortality, but we, as readers of either the magnum opus edition of the novel or indeed the notes of Mack's edition, know him to have been modelled on Robert Patterson, quote, the remarkable person called by the title of Old Mortality, who was well known in Scotland about the end of the last century, and whom Scott had met in the churchyard of Dunotter about 30 years since or more. By the time we ourselves encounter Old Mortality for the first time, we have been informed by Jedediah Cleese-Botham in the introduction to Volume 1 of Tales of My Landlord that Peter Patterson is no longer among the living. So the idea is Peter Patterson collects the Tales of My Landlord. He also collects stories told by Old Mortality, and because he, as we'll hear in a minute, has already died, it's his boss, Jedediah, who edits these papers. So by the time we ourselves encounter Old Mortality for the first time, Jedediah Cleese-Botham has told us that Peter Patterson is no longer among the living. In fact, the first tomb in the graveyard, which we are invited to view, is Peter Patterson's own, with, as Jedediah tells us, quote, a handsome headstone erected at my proper charges in the spot, bearing the name of Peter Patterson, was the date of his nativity and sepulture, with the testimony of his merits attested by myself as his superior and patron. Patterson then has, as it were, been ghosted by Jedediah. That is, he has become one of the ghosts the village boys are afraid of, which is why they keep away from the graveyard in the twilight. Patterson, in turn, will soon ghost Old Mortality shortly after the latter has predicted his, Patterson's, death. But though, quote, in all probability, he did not err in supposing that my span of life may be abridged in youth, he had overestimated the period of his own pilgrimage on earth. By the end of the first chapter, then, of Scott's three, if you like, avatars, Old Mortality, Jedediah Cleese-Botham, Peter Patterson, only the second one, in generational terms, not in their order of appearance, will still be very much alive, Jedediah Cleese-Botham. However, the key issue in this first chapter of Old Mortality is not so much the passing of time as such, nor is it the passing, or rather pastness, of literary styles, in Patterson's case, that of the mid-18th century graveyard school and its elegiac meditations on unused human potential, the conditions of country life and mortality, but the politics of memory and memorialization. Although the passing of time should affect everyone and every gravestone equally, some gravestones are, as it were, more equal than others. While that of Dominus Johann de Hamel still bears his name, his armorial bearings have been defaced by time. His neighbor, the bishop, has fared even worse in that he has become nameless and is solely defined by his ci-devant accoutrements of cross, mitre, and pastoral staff. By contrast, in fact, in glaring contrast to their respective owners' social status, two other stones, and we may add Peter Patterson's, still convey legibly the histories of those persecuted Presbyterians who lie beneath them, presumably also their names, though Patterson strangely does not name them himself. This comparatively minor instance of information accidentally or deliberately withheld alerts us to the more fundamental question of how, in the Tale of Old Mortality, knowledge about the past is gathered and transmitted by whom, and by implication, which historical events are remembered and commemorated, together or not, with those who took part in them. Questions which Patterson himself will address in the final paragraphs of this first chapter. Specifically, what Patterson discusses, and indeed in his own activities as collector of tales performs, is the transition from communicative to cultural memory. Communicative memory lives in everyday interaction and communication, and for this reason has only a limited time depth of 3 to 4 generations. In Old Mortality, these are the generation of Peter Patterson, which is also Scott's generation, Cleese-Botham's Old Mortalities, and Old Mortalities covenanting forebears. Still, even in, by definition, non-institutional communicative memory, there are frames, communicative genres, traditions of communication and thematization, and above all, affective ties that bind together families, groups, and generations. All of these can be glimpsed when the peasantry take their children to the Ganderklou graveyard, show them, quote, the tombs of these victims of prelacy, and narrate the fate of the sufferers, usually concluding by exhorting them to be ready, should time call for it, to resist to the death in the cause of civil and religious liberty, like their brave forefathers. In parenthesis, we may note here first that in the novel proper, which is set, as I said, in 1679, characters frequently recall events from the 1640s, thus extending the time depth of communicative memory by a 5th generation. And second, through these chains of eyewitnesses, Scott's contemporary readers are arguably more closely linked to, quote, those who sleep beneath than, quote, by the reflection that they have once been what now we are, unquote, as Patterson muses. Scott's narrative strategy, then, is not to distance these readers from, but to assert the immediacy of the past. Once the time span of 3 to 4 generations is extended, memory requires institutions of preservation and re-embodiment. That is the work of collectors and transcribers, of editors and publishers, of librarians, historians, or teachers. Thus, once committed to paper, Tales told to Pattison by the Wallace Inn landlord in The Black Dwarf, which is the first volume of Tales of My Landlord, and now by Old Mortality, as well as by moorland farmers, packmen, weavers, tailors, more than one descendant of ancient and honorable families, and right reverend authority, enter the realm of cultural memory, which is, of course, both Peter Patterson's and Scott's own. Scott, as the author of Tale of Old Mortality, consults sources that are predominantly written, several of which he mentions in the magnum opus preface, as well as much earlier in the minstrelsy of the Scottish border notes to the Ballad of Bothwell Brake. At the same time, Scott's novel becomes itself a re-embodiment for the benefit of further generations. Hence, once the mechanisms of this cultural memory making are revealed, as they are in this chapter, it is difficult to forget, nor does Scott expect us to, that memories are, and cultural memory is, just that, made, not given. 3 or 4 either killed in the skirmish or shot after being made prisoners. The country churchyard as Traumascape. There are various readings of the opening chapter of the Tale of Old Mortality and of the novel more generally, which reflect upon the interconnectedness of time and space in Tale of Old Mortality by digging, as it were, through the layers of Scott's landscape descriptions from the realistic, or perhaps functional, to the symbolic and typological, and which also acknowledge Scott's indebtedness to landscape painting, to Burkean aesthetics of the sublime and the beautiful, and to contemporary theories of geological time, as in James Hutton's Theory of the Earth of 1788. Thus, to use an example from a later section of the novel, the battlefield of Drumclog can be seen in military terms as offering certain topographical advantages to the Covenanting side, but also symbolically as a site at which the Royalist party have ventured into a wilderness which earlier had already become associated with the Covenanters and are expelled from that wilderness. Finally, for some of the Covenanters, every place in their lives has its potential prototype in the Bible, usually in the Old Testament, so that radical preacher Kettle Drummle can lay claim to, quote, no small share of the victory as he has prayed on the mount of Jehovah Nissi, like Moses, that Israel may prevail over Amalek. Returning once again to the opening chapter of the Tale of Old Mortality, critical approaches to Scott's landscape have more recently been enriched by Susan Oliver's insistence, first articulated in an article Walter Scott and the Matter of Landscape, Ecologies of Violence for Our Time of 2014, that cultural memories must be read ecologically as well as in the forms of things written. Hence, she reminds us that the luxuriant vegetation in Peter Patterson's graveyard is dependent on a soil, quote, that is nutritionally enriched by the effects of torture and murder, that is, by the corpses interred there. While building on all these readings, what I propose to do in the remaining sections of this paper is to bring to bear initially again on the country churchyard of the opening chapter and then on other settings of the novel, a very specific conceptualization of time-space coordinates, namely the concept of the traumascape as proposed by Australian cultural historian Maria Tumarkin. A traumascape, she writes, is a place which is marked by traumatic legacies of violence, suffering, and loss. The past is never quite over. Years, decades after the event, the past is still unfinished business. because trauma is contained not in an event as such, but in the way this event is experienced, traumascapes become much more than physical settings of tragedies. They emerge as spaces where events are experienced and re-experienced across time. Full of visual and sensory triggers capable of eliciting a whole palette of emotions, traumascapes catalyze and shape remembering and reliving of traumatic events. It is through these places that the past, whether buried or laid bare for all to see, continues to inhabit and refashion the present. Tumarkin mainly looks at more sort of contemporary traumascapes. I mean, specifically at the sites of 9/11 and in sort of near the field in Pennsylvania and all that. But I think it's a useful concept for older traumatic events and also for the way in which people deal with these events. Because a traumatic event often cannot be marked in time, researchers who study the aftermath of these events have suggested that they tend to change dramatically how time is experienced, so that post-traumatic time does not appear to flow from the past to the present in a straight line, but to have become non-linear and volatile. Because of this, it's particularly important to mark these events in space. For instance, by leaving small tokens such as candles, flowers, toys, etc., but also by erecting monuments. The site of the traumatic event, a site which is both haunted and haunting, also serves as the focus of rituals such as pilgrimages. These may often feel cathartic for the individual who undertakes them. For the group or nation in which these rituals are performed, they are practical as well as symbolic steps taken to reaffirm the strength and solidarity of the community of mourners through honoring and protecting, if you like, the human rights of the dead. Their presence at traumascapes, it is impossible to ignore. The traumatic event marked by the graves of the Covenanters in chapter 1 of the Tale of Old Mortality is obviously their violent death at the hands of the royalist troops after the Pentland Rising, presumably after the Battle of Rollion Green on November the 28th, 1666. Significantly, they were buried in not just any burial ground, but where they were actually killed. And it is this fact which turns this particular graveyard into a traumascape. It is for this reason why the village boys are afraid to venture near it after dark, but it's also why it is sought out by various types of pilgrims who respond to it quite differently. Peter Patterson, Old Mortality, and the peasants who take their children to see the graves and to listen to the stories associated with them. It is they, the peasants and their children, and of course Old Mortality himself, who reassert the moral values for which the persecuted Presbyterians have died: civil and religious liberty. If one is prepared to accept for the moment that the burial ground in chapter 1 of the Tale of Old Mortality does, as a traumascape, indicate a point in space at which the past erupts into the present, then 3 further avenues of exploration are opened up. First, then, we can discuss whether the concept of the traumascape can usefully be applied to some of the other settings of what is arguably one of the bleakest, as well as perhaps the most violent of Scottish novels. Can the concept be applied, for instance, to prisons, such as Dumbarton Castle, which is the picture you see on the left, or Bass Rock on the right, where in the latter Bass Rock, Habakkuk McElrath, who exhibits all the symptoms of severe traumatization, has been held. Those of you who know James Robertson's The Fanatic, there is a long passage about the Covenanters. I mean, this is the same period. I mean, the Covenanters being held prisoner on Bass Rock and in Dumbarton Castle. Can it also be applied, the concept of traumascape, that is, can it also be applied to battlefields such as Drumclog on your left and Bothwell Bridge on your right, the latter of which even, and we're back at Old Mortality, the latter of which even stolid Cuddy Hedrick cannot look at years after the battle without seeing in his mind's eye the blood running as fast on the top of that bridge beyond as ever the water ran below it, unquote. So second step, if we kind of sort of accept that the concept can be applied to other settings of the novel, can we also try and step outside the confines of Scott's text and investigate how actual historic sites of traumatic events have been designated by various communities as traumascapes, that is, have become destinations for pilgrims in search of either reconciliation or confrontation with the past, and either motivated by a desire to put a full stop to everything that happened, or else by the burning need to discard all such full stops and to reject the pretense of closure. Thus, for instance, the Scottish Covenanter Memorials Association, established in 1966 with a view to preserving the many memorials which date from the killing times, encourages its members, and by extension the visitors to its website, to visit and care for the memorials it lists. And you can see a long list of the various sort of parts of Scotland where you can find Covenanting memorials, and a couple of examples of these. Funnily enough, the Scottish Covenanter Memorials Association also provides advice on how to carry out simple cleaning and tidying operations in much the same way as Old Mortality wanders around Scotland to sort of tidy up the various churchyards. Though it does warn us to not become Old Mortalities ourselves, but to leave the more difficult technical work to professional sculptors. This reminds me of, I mean, this is a completely sort of different context, but I used to have to clean one of those stumbling stones, which you see in German and other countries, to remember the victims of the Holocaust who lived there, and every November the 9th, just before the cleaning operation, I used to get sort of detailed information on how to go about cleaning that. So we're not to use the kinds of instruments a professional sculptor would use, but we use clean water and so on. So if these are sites for pilgrimages, there is, interestingly enough, one such pilgrimage of sorts, which is occasionally mentioned as one of the sources of inspiration for the Tale of Old Mortality, namely the assembly of thousands of textile workers in the hills of Drumclog on June the 13th, 1815, described as motley rabble by William Aiton in his 1821 History of the Reencounter of Drumclog, when he reflects on, quote, the folly and danger of those lower orders in society becoming politicians or attempting to direct the government. Agent's history, incidentally, also contains a chapter on what is historically correct and what is fictitious in the Tale of Old Mortality. So my first step, I look at other sites in the novel and look at them as traumascapes. My second step is I step outside the confines of the novel and look at traumascapes associated in this case with the Covenanters in contemporary Scotland and how people approach these sites. And I now come to my third step, which is perhaps slightly less obvious. So third then, and more speculatively, we might consider whether Scott's novel, in the process of representing traumascapes, does in fact become one itself, at least sort of metaphorically speaking. That is a cathartic location which confronts its Scottish readership with the violent pasts of their country. In other words, I'm asking myself and everybody out there whether Traumascape is rather like Anne Rickney's portable monument, a useful concept in thinking about how different groups of readers recycle Scott's texts at different historical moments. Particularly, I think, as the concept of Traumascape foregrounds, as perhaps that of portable monument does not, or not to the same extent, that the past, to quote Tumarkin again, is still unfinished business. As a first and very tentative answer, I should like to draw our attention to the pilgrimage the novel itself performs, namely to how it circles back at least twice, albeit obliquely, to its opening chapter. When the protagonist of the Tale of Old Mortality, Henry Morton, returns to Scotland after the Glorious Revolution in 1688-89, more than 10 years after he's had to leave the country because of his involvement in the Covenanting movement, he returns as the ghost of his former self, and he undertakes a ride along a burn, which Susan Oliver has identified rightly, I think, as the stream in which Peter Patterson's pupils in the opening chapter fish for trout or minnows. Finally, the last but one paragraph of the novel, leaving out for the moment its nominal conclusion, contains yet another description of a tombstone, annotated as is Peter Patterson's allusion to his future resting place in chapter 1 by Jedediah Cleishbotham. Quote, "As Balfour's grasp could not have been unclenched without cutting off his hands, both were thrown into a hasty grave, still marked with a root stone and a ruder epigraph, which, unlike Jedediah, I will not now reproduce." Thank you.